today we are on part 2 of our journey of binding the Book of the Dragonborn. I'm so excited to get to the useful part of this project because I'm actually going to be, instead of making it so that this book is like the actual text from the game, it's going to be a sketchbook. So what that means is that I'm going to be making a weathered looking book block, so it looks aged and old to match the game, but then when you flip through the pages, they're blank. So I'm going to have to cut my pages according to the dimensions that I came up with in my last video. So I'm going to pop the dimensions somewhere around this area. So I have to cut out my paper, and I had to get a bunch more paper for this project because I did not have enough, unfortunately. I believe the book ends up being about 1.75 inches thick when it's done, and I only had enough paper to make it like an inch thick, which is not enough. I want it to be like a chunky book. Yeah, like totally lopsided now. So I guess we will just get going on this. So here I am cutting out some of the pages to match the dimensions that I came up with, which was that each sheet needed to be 9 by 13.5 because that is the width of 2 pages that are 6.75. It is a square-backed book, so you can see that it's not rounded at all. The odd thing about this one is that while the back is square, if you look at the book from the side, the pages have a curve at the end. I'm assuming that that's probably just some weird idiosyncrasy, and I want to maintain the squareness of the spine. So another key point is that the end pages are actually what we call self-end pages. They're made of the same thing as the rest of the book. So they're made of the same type of paper, they're not marbled at all. The book also strongly resembles the Book of Hours Yusuf Ruan, currently located at the RISD Museum, which is dated around 1510, late medieval period. So once I was finished cutting out my pages, I needed to fold them. So I folded all the pages, which took about, I want to say, an hour. It was a lot of paper. And once that was done, I put it into the press. After being pressed for about 24 hours, I took it out, and then I put the pages together into signatures. Signatures are basically just pages just stacked within each other. I originally did 6 sheet signatures. However, the method that I'm going to be using to bind this, which is called a buried cord binding or a sawn-in binding. There's a couple of different things you can call it. You can call it a recessed cord binding. Basically, it's just the thing that gives it that nice flat back without any ridges or bands showing. So I realized that the type of binding I'm going to do could potentially cause a problem with there being 6 sheets per signature, because I'm going to have to saw in holes from the outside for the cords to be buried into. And I was going to have to go pretty dang far down into the book to be able to hit that sixth sheet. So I swapped it out to 4 sheet signatures, which actually ended up great because then I had 4 total sheets left over at the end, which could then be used to make my end paper packets. So I have all my pages folded. It's quite thick, as you can see. So I'm going to sandwich my chunk of pages between 2 pieces of bookboard, put them in the press after evening out the edge so that it's nice and flat, because like right now well, you can see it's just kind of flappy. And then when I am done with that, I will measure along the spine to determine how far my holes need to be apart. After that, I will do the sawing, and I'm going to be using a laundry drying rack as a sewing jig because I don't have one right now. That's a future project that I'm going to be making, is a sewing jig to match my book press, but that does not exist yet. So I will do that. I've got some jute cord that I will, oh god, I hate how this stuff feels. I have some jute cord that I will be using for the recessed cords. But basically, I'm having to do something where I can't just do a case binding because it's leather. It's also really thick, and I want this thing to be fairly sturdy. So I'm doing a recessed cord binding so that I end up with another important key thing about this book is that, like this one, we have no raised bands. It's completely flat. And this can be achieved multiple ways. This, I'm guessing, is probably done in a similar method to how I'm going to sew mine, where you recess the cords of the spine in that you're sewing, and then those cords are going to then be attached to the cover boards. So next step is to get some book board, sandwich my pages in between it, put that in my book press, saw some holes, and then sew my pages. So after putting my signatures together, I actually pressed it for a little bit longer, and when that was done, it was time to measure and saw my holes. So the first thing that I did was I prepped some cover board, which these actually will end up being the covers once I cut them down a bit more, but it was done so that I could get a really even edge of my spine so that when I saw, every single signature has the same amount of cut into it. So I put the pile of pages in between these two boards and aligned everything, put it into the press and closed it up so that the end of the book was sticking out, and now it is time to measure. So for my measurements, I measured 1 inch in from either end, and each of these holes is going to be less deep because these are not going to have buried cords, these are only going to have sewing done to them. The other 4 are actually quite deep. The first set is 1 inch in from those original lines, and then from that point, 1.5 inches in from those new lines. So all in all, there are going to be 6 places where I am poking some holes and or sawing. And once I had that set up, it was time to do the sawing. So I used a little handsaw. It is not the correct kind that I should have used for this. I really need to get something with finer teeth and that has a better angle that I can actually use to do this correctly. So my sawing is a little bit messy, and I actually had to fine tune it using a file afterwards because it just wasn't quite right. So once the sawing was done, it was time to sew my pages. I used, I believe, a modified kettle stitch is essentially what this is. It is very similar to the method that I used in my previous bookbinding video, except that I'm doing it with recessed cords this time. So that step's a little bit different, but the overall motion is the same. Now, mind you, this is my first time doing a buried cord binding, so I would not take this as any kind of tutorial. once I was done sewing the pages, it was not actually time to glue, but alas, I glued anyway. I would not recommend doing it this way because really what I should have done is left it unglued until I had my end papers sewn on after weathering them, but unfortunately I jumped the gun, followed my normal procedure because I don't usually sew my end papers on. I usually glue them or do self end papers. So, kind of a problem. So I glued it, stuck it into the press, and then it was time to do some weathering tests. So I did some weathering testing, and ooh, that's kind of a cool gradient effect. I have chosen what I'm going to do to weather the end papers. I'm also going to be trying to weather the edge of the book, very likely by literally just smooshing a used tea bag up against the edges, because it works better than like a paintbrush does. You get more pigment. So this one was watered down acrylic paint, which I actually still have here, but I did not like how it looked. This barely looks different, so here's a control sheet. This is just the original sketchbook paper. Barely any difference there. There's a little bit of aging, and that's just from like some speckling that I did. This one is coffee. This was brushed on with a paintbrush. These were all brushed on with a paintbrush, and it wasn't very effective, and it smells really weird. I like coffee. It does not smell like coffee. It smells strange, so I'm going to set that aside. And then we have brushed on and then spattered tea, which is closer to what we're looking for. And last, and the one I'm actually going for, this was done in a tea bath and then spattered on as well. This gives me the best effect I'm looking for. I did dry it with a hair dryer so that we didn't end up with quite as much crunkling as if we would have if it was done by oven. And once it presses, I think it will actually be fairly flat. I want just the end paper to have this effect. And then hopefully when I do the edges of the book block, it won't be too like wavy. Since I'm not going to be soaking those, I think we'll be okay. Since I'm just going to be basically brushing it on with the tea bag. So this is what I'm going for. So this is what the interior of each page will look like. This is what the end papers will look like. It smells really good. It smells like tea, which I have no problem with. So I'm going to get my big tray of tea that I dunked this in and do my end papers and dry them. Honestly, I think this is the thing I had the most fun with on this project because I love making things look old. Weathering is a very fun process to do. After I selected the kind of weathering I was going to do, I went ahead and I made a bath of tea in a pan, and then I basically just dunked my end papers in, the ones that are going to be colored. So with the type of end papers I'm doing, you actually nest a colored end paper into an end paper that matches the rest of your book block. So I took the ones that needed to be colored and I dunked them in the tea bath one at a time, so it was only 2 sheets, and took them out, placed them on a plate, dabbed it with a paper towel to get some of the excess moisture off, and then I flicked some more tea off of a brush on there to get a little bit of a mottled effect. It ended up a little bit less noticeable than I was hoping it would be, but it still looks really cool. So once that was done, I broke out the hairdryer and dried the paper. You can do this in the oven as well, however, I wanted to make sure that these were more on the flat side, and if you do it in the oven, it warps the paper a lot more, which is not something I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that these were as flat as possible and nice and smooth. So they still did warp a little bit, but I think that a night in the press will take care of that once they're sewn onto the book. So once they were dry, it was time to attach them to the rest of the book block. The first thing that I did was I measured where the holes needed to be for everything to line up really nicely, and then I poked some holes into the end papers where I needed to sew, and I stitched them on. I used the same method, essentially, that I did for the rest of the book. I think this would have been probably easier if I had changed my order of operations and done the weathering before I did all of the sewing, because then I could have just attach them at the same time and then glued everything at the same time, and I think things would have ended up a bit nicer, but you do what you gotta do. So once I had my end papers attached, it was time to put it back in the press because, you gotta press things. And when that was done, I needed to weather up my edges. So I unfortunately forgot to film this part, but I basically just took the tea bag that I used to make my tea bath and pressed it into the pages all along the sides. It actually ended up looking really cool. It worked really well, and it was much more pigmented than if I were trying to like paint tea onto it. So once these were stitched on, the book block was complete. Okay, so I have a book block that has a perfectly clean inside and a perfectly grubby outside. So I'm pretty happy with how this whole thing turned out. It's not absolutely perfect, but honestly, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a pretty beat up book, to be honest with you. The spine isn't perfect. It could have been a little bit more square, but it'll be fine for my purposes. This thing is supposed to be kind of beat up looking, so it's fine. That at least will be accurate. And funny enough, it has the mostly square spine and then the weird slightly rounded pages of the one in the game. So happy accidents, right? So my last video in this series is going to be me attaching the cover boards, the hollow spine tube, which I will explain later because I know that sounds weird, and the leather cover and tooling. So if you want to catch that, make sure you subscribe, and if you want to see any of the other parts of this process, go ahead and check out the playlist that I have set up. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.